Okay, let's unpack this. We've got quite a stack here. Articles, research, your notes, all diving deep into the history of Canada. And it's a really long story, isn't it? Complex, full of surprises.
Absolutely. And we're not just, ticking off dates. This is more about understanding the big forces, the millennia of change
Right.
from the very first peoples through all the contact, the conflict, the cooperation, right up to Canada today.
So the mission here is,
Well, the goal is to pull out the really crucial insights from all this material, give you a shortcut, sort of, to grasping the main points, and maybe, hopefully, find a few aha moments, too.
okay. And thinking about where it starts, I mean, thousands of years before Europeans, right? Lands inhabited by Indigenous people.
Exactly, for thousands and thousands of
With
years.
their own distinct cultures, trading networks, beliefs, some already ancient history by the time ships arrived.
That deep history is just foundational. You've got evidence like from Blue Shish Caves pointing way back, maybe over 10,000 years, potentially people following those ice-free corridors south.
Well,
And the sources mention these distinct cultural periods, like the Woodland and Hopewell traditions. You see connections, shared art, trade goods across vast distances.
it's a sophisticated society.
It's very. And then you have the incredible diversity Europeans encountered. Coastal peoples relying on salmon and cedar, plains cultures centered on bison, agriculturalists near the Great Lakes, each shaped by their environment.
Right.
What's really fascinating, too, is how the sources point to their own historical records, oral traditions documenting huge migrations or the forming of powerful groups like the Iroquois Confederacy, sometimes even with specific traditional dates like around 1142 CE for the Confederacy's founding.
And then the European chapter kicks off. And like you said, not just the French and British we always hear about.
Well, not initially, anyway.
The sources hint at Vikings, right? Around 1000 CE, Lonson Meadows in Newfoundland. That's pretty early.
That's a surprising little footnote, yeah. And there's mentions of Spanish and Portuguese explorers mapping coasts, maybe leaving names like Labrador.
So the early picture is more crowded than you might think.
Definitely more crowded and more tentative. Early fishing stations came and went before permanent settlements really took hold.
Okay, so these early explorations, they start to lead to claims, competing claims.
Right, that sets the stage for centuries of conflict, really. The sources detail France claiming New France, starting with Cartier in 1534. Then Champlain founds Quebec City in 1608.
And the English are there too.
Almost at the same time, claiming St. John's, Newfoundland. So you immediately have this rivalry over North America, and it gets tangled up with wars back in Europe.
And Indigenous nations get pulled in.
Absolutely. Into alliances, into the wars themselves. The Iroquois Confederacy, for instance, they became pretty significant opponents of the French early on.
And we're not talking small skirmishes here. The sources mention a whole series of French and Indian wars, late 17th, mid-18th century.
Yeah, major conflicts that really reshaped who controlled what.
Key events like the British capturing Acadia, that was ceded in 1713.
Correct, which led the French to build that huge fortress of Louisbourg to protect what they still held.
And then that awful expulsion of the Acadians in the 1750s.
It's a really tragic event, the British scattering thousands of French speakers from the Maritimes, many ending up as far away as Louisiana, becoming the Cajuns.
Which leads us to the Treaty of Paris, 1763, a huge turning point.
Massive. France gives up most of its North American territory to Great Britain, and that's when Voltaire supposedly made that quip.
Right, about valuing a sugar island, Guadeloupe, more than Canada, dismissing it as just
A few acres of snow. Yeah, that's the famous line the sources mention.
a few acres of snow.
Yeah.
That obviously became a lot more. So under British rule now, what's the immediate challenge?
Well, governing this huge territory, you've got the existing French-speaking Catholic population, the Canadians and Indigenous peoples. How do you manage that?
And the sources point to things like the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
Yes, which tried, imperfectly maybe, but significantly, to acknowledge Aboriginal title on the frontier, sort of draw a line.
And the Quebec Act of 1774, that seems important.
It was huge for its time, granting protections for French civil law, the right to practice Catholicism. It was a calculated move, really, to keep the Canadians loyal as things were heating up with the American colonies.
Ah, right, because that's the next big thing, the American Revolution.
And it spills over, directly impacting Canada.
How so?
Tens of thousands of loyalist colonists loyal to Britain fled north.
Right, the United Empire Loyalists.
Exactly. So many settled around the St. John River that the British actually carved out a whole new colony for them, New Brunswick in 1784.
And then they divided Quebec.
Yep, in 1791. Into Upper Canada, mostly Anglophone settlers, and Lower Canada, predominantly Francophone, trying to accommodate both groups.
Okay, so this influx plus the U.S. presence, that leads to the War of 1812.
Directly. The sources confirm the U.S. invasion plans aimed at taking Canada.
But they were repelled.
They were. What's interesting is the mix of forces. British regulars, local militia, and really crucial support from First Nations allies like Tecumseh's Confederacy.
Did the border change?
No, the border stayed the same in the end. But the war, well, it definitely solidified a sense of separate identity for many in British North America. And maybe, as the sources suggest, a lingering distrust of American ambitions.
Makes sense. So after the war, what's next? Demands for more self-rule.
Increasingly, yes. You get the rebellions of 1837 in both Upper and Lower Canada, essentially protests against the colonial system, the lack of accountability.
Did they succeed?
Militarily, no. But the sources say they sparked a realization. The old way wasn't working. It led straight to Lord Durham's report and this push for responsible government.
Responsible government. That sounds key. What does it mean exactly?
Fundamentally, it meant the government's ministers, the executive branch, had to have the support of the elected assembly. They were responsible to the assembly, not just the crown's appointed governor.
So power shifts to the elected folks.
Exactly. Nova Scotia got it first, 1848. Then it followed quickly in the United Province of Canada, which was created by merging Upper and Lower Canada back together after the rebellions in 1840.
Okay, so more self-government, growing economic links.
Mm-hmm.
Is this setting the stage for Confederation?
It is. And Confederation in 1867, well, the sources show it wasn't just one thing driving it, it was a whole mix of pressures.
Like what?
Well, the British wanted the colonies to handle more of their own defense costs. There was a real need for better infrastructure, especially a railway linking everything.
The railway, right.
Different kinds of nationalism bubbling up, English and French Canadian, political deadlock in the United Province, and yeah, some worry, maybe overstated sometimes, but worry about the U.S. after their Civil War.
So 1867. Initially, just 4 colonies joined.
That's right. Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. But the new Dominion immediately looked west.
Using the railway as bait.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Promised the Canadian Pacific Railway to get British Columbia in by 1871 and PEI in 1873. Newfoundland, though. They held out for a long time.
Until 1949, yeah. So as Canada expands west, what happens with Indigenous peoples?
It enters a really difficult new phase. The sources show the Canadian government taking over treaty-making from Britain.
And the goal of these treaties was?
Often it was about extinguishing Aboriginal title to open land for settlement for resources, creating the reserve system.
At the same time, you get institutions like the Mounties.
With the Northwest Mounted Police, established from 1873, partly to assert Canadian sovereignty, partly to, well, control the West and suppress resistance, like the Métis efforts to protect their lands and autonomy under Louis Riel.
The Red River and Northwest Rebellions.
1869 and 1885. The sources note that 1885 was really the young country's first major independent military action.
And then there's the Indian Act, 1876, and the residential schools. The sources highlight these as, well, incredibly damaging.
Devastatingly so. These were deliberate government policies designed to break down Indigenous cultures, languages, assimilate children. The legacy, as the sources emphasize, is profound and painful, still felt today.
It's a heavy part of the story.
It really is.
Okay, so late 19th, early 20th century, Canada's building itself up. Laws, immigration.
Yeah, things like a national criminal code in 1892, trying to create uniformity, a sense of maybe national confidence growing. Laurier's famous line about the 20th century belonging to Canada, fueled by big waves of immigration.
But tensions, too, with Britain, with the U.S.
Oh, yeah. Disagreements over things like the Alaska boundary, debates about trade with the U.S. It wasn't all smooth sailing.
Then, the First World War. That must have been transformative.
Hugely, especially battles like Vimy Ridge. They forged a sense of shared sacrifice and identity for many English Canadians anyway, but at a terrible cost.
And divisions, too. The conscription crisis.
A massive division. Really split the country, French and English. But the war also accelerated change for women federal vote in 1918. And the sources mention pioneers like Agnes MacPhail getting into Parliament soon after, though Quebec took longer for provincial suffrage, 1940.
After the war, Canada seems to push for more independence on the world stage.
Definitely. Got its own seat at the Paris Peace Conference, joined the League of Nations independently. Moments like the Chinook crisis in 22.
where Canada said no to automatic military support for Britain,
Exactly. A signal Canada was making its own foreign policy calls. This led towards the Statute of Westminster in 1931.
which basically recognized Canada as independent legislatively.
Co-equal with the UK. A massive step towards full sovereignty.
But then the Great Depression hits.
Hits Canada incredibly hard. Sources paint a grim picture. Massive unemployment, economic collapse.
How did the government respond?
Debates, different approaches. PM King initially thought it was temporary. His successor, Bennett, tried more intervention. It also fueled unrest, new political movements.
Then World War II, another huge mobilization.
Absolutely. Canada deliberately delayed declaring war by a week in 39, just to underscore its independence.
Oh, interesting.
But then went all in. Resources, air training, convoy protection, troops overseas, a major contribution.
But also dark chapters, like the Japanese-Canadian internment.
Yes, the sources mention that injustice. Driven by wartime fear and racism, thousands interned on the West Coast. The war also pulled Canada much closer to the U.S. through defense agreements.
Okay, post-war era. Prosperity, social programs.
Relatively speaking, yes. This is when you see things like universal healthcare taking shape, pensions expanding, key parts of modern Canada's identity, and of course Newfoundland finally joins in 49.
Right, completing the map. And the Cold War. Canada aligns with the U.S.
Generally, yes. Joined NATO, fought in Korea. The sources mention things like asserting Arctic sovereignty, sometimes controversially like relocating Inuit communities.
But Canada also carves out its own role.
Peacekeeping.
Famously, yes. Lester Pearson and the Suez Crisis in '56, that became a defining aspect of Canadian foreign policy for a long time. Though there were always debates, the sources show, about how close to get to the U.S. economically and militarily.
Then the 60s. Seems like a decade of huge change. Quebec's Quiet Revolution. Massive change, rapid modernization in Quebec, fueling a powerful nationalist movement, leading eventually to things like the October Crisis in 1970, and later the sovereignty referendums.
And the flag debate, that was the '60s too, right?
1965. Adopting the maple leaf flag, a really symbolic moment, defining a visual identity separate from Britain. And Expo 67 in Montreal was a huge coming out party for the nation.
And immigration changes, moving beyond just Europe.
Big time. Policies shifted in the 60s, opening doors to people from all over the world, transforming cities, which ties into Pierre Trudeau championing official bilingualism and multiculturalism.
Trying to build unity out of diversity.
That was the idea, though his era also saw growing alienation in the West, often linked to energy policies.
And finally, bringing the Constitution home. Patriation in 1982.
A major legal milestone, ending the UK Parliament's last bit of authority over Canada, and crucially, entrenching the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Giving Canadians constitutionally protected rights.
Exactly, which the government couldn't easily override.
So the sources bring us pretty much up to date. Recent decades, trade deals like NAFTA.
Yep, integration with the U.S., but also debates about independence. Ongoing Indigenous land issues like the Oka Crisis in '90.
Politically.
Yeah.
Failed attempts to bring Quebec into the Constitution.
Yeah.
Meech Lake, Charlottetown.
Right, leading to that incredibly close 1995 Quebec referendum. Intense time.
And grappling with the past. Residential schools apology, truth and reconciliation.
Yes, confronting that legacy. Plus, big social changes. Same-sex marriage, cannabis legalization, Canada's role in places like Afghanistan, and the sources touch on the political landscape right up to recent years, reactions to global events influencing things here.
Well, it's a massive amount of history we just covered.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But that's why we did this deep dive with you, using these sources, focusing on these key moments, these shifts, these big ideas, trying to give you that framework for understanding how Canada was shaped.
Wow, yeah. We really have covered a tremendous amount of ground, haven't we? I mean, from those incredibly ancient Indigenous roots and complex early societies, through all the European layers, the conflict, the forming of the Dominion, pushing west, those huge world wars, and the Depression.
Navigating all of that.
And finding its place kind of on the world stage while still wrestling with all these internal questions. Identity, rights, unity.
Indeed. We've seen how geography mattered, how things like the fur trade drove the economy, the constant political back and forth, the wars, and those deep social and cultural shifts. All drawn from the sources you've got there, you really should have a much richer sense now of the key forces.
Yeah, hopefully this really is that shortcut you mentioned, a way to get grounded quickly in a huge topic. With some memorable bits like Voltaire's Acres of Snow or, the reasons behind creating New Brunswick or the constitutional stuff.
And thinking about these sources, it's so clear Canada's history isn't just one straight line, is it?
Not at all.
It's full of contradictions, different viewpoints. I mean, the sources even mention historiography, how historians still debate events like the conquest.
Right? Different interpretation.
Exactly, it's
Yeah.
constantly evolving.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought. Something to mull over based on everything we've just dug into from these sources.
Okay, so if you consider those persistent themes, managing all that internal diversity, Indigenous peoples, French, British, later multicultural immigrants,
Hmm.
and balancing that alongside the continuous influence, sometimes real pressure, from its huge neighbor, the United States.
Right. So what does this deep dive suggest might be more fundamental to, like, the core of Canadian identity? It's mostly about trying to synthesize and balance all those diverse internal parts, or is it maybe forged, maybe even defined just as much by that relationship with and the need to be distinct from those external forces, especially the U.S.?